Okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started. So I see everyone is muted, which is great. Welcome to the St. John Henry Newman Association 2020 conference. Normally we hold it in an actual physical location, but this time, of course, given circumstances, we all have to do it this way. Normally, the conference is a great time of fellowship. We get to meet each other. It's a time to not only hear our ideas about Newman, but also just get to know each other. So I hope, as Dr. Christie will say later, I hope we all get to know each other and talk and feel like we can replicate the on-ground experience. So we'll go ahead and start our session today, but just a quick note about the schedule. So there's a session from 6:30 to 7:20. That's this session. Then there's another one from 7:30 to 8:20. And then, of course, we encourage you to stay for attend a session there. And then at 8:30, Bob Christie, who is the president of the association, will be doing his greetings and also just giving a general update. So that'll take about 30 minutes. So we encourage you to stay through until then, and we'll talk about tomorrow's session. Okay, so tonight we have the pleasure of having Luke Donahue, C.S.C, talk to us. He's a seminarian with the Congregation of the Holy Cross, and he's going to be talking to us. The title of his paper is Turris Eburnea et Consolatrix Afflictorum, Pastoral Implications of Newman's Mariology for a Suffering World. So the way we'll do it is Luke will give his paper, and then when he's done, we can go ahead and have a discussion. And discussion is always a great part of this. So if you have any questions, we'd love to hear them. So we haven't done this before, so we'll see how it works. You could send your questions to me through the chat. So in the chat, I'm David Delio. My name is Ono, AK. I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself. My name is Ono, O-N-O. So you can send your questions to me in the chat, or you could just raise your hand and I will call on you, right? So that way we can sort of have an orderly question and answer session. Okay, so Luke, you can take it away.
Thank you very much, Ono. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening, even though it has to be digitally in this very unprecedented time. So I'm very glad to be talking to you about the Blessed Virgin, a woman I love very much, and I think hopefully probably all of us do to some extent. And specifically, I'm going to be looking at Newman's Mariology and some of the pastoral implications of that. So I will be looking at some of the meditations from the Meditations and Devotions, and specifically the Meditations on Mary's Dolors. And I'll apply them to pastoral context. I plan to look at their application to the lives of the suffering, most especially those who are ill, and to their caregivers. The pastoral application in healthcare is important in part because humanity has always grappled with illness and death. But it takes on a special importance today in light of the recent COVID-19 pandemic, and in view of the recent trend, especially in Western countries, to abort children with disabilities and to euthanize persons who are elderly or have terminal illnesses. The length of this presentation will not allow me to go into much detail on Newman's broader Mariology, nor his other works on suffering, although I may allude to them and paint broad outlines of his thought. I will begin with a very brief outline of Newman's views on suffering and on the saints, especially the concept of patron saints, then apply this to his Mariological thought. Finally, I will look in detail on the text of these Meditations on Mary's Dolors, and then I will see how they apply to today's world. Newman, in his sermon Bodily Suffering, claims that the cross of Christ allows our suffering as Christians to be meritorious. Christians who suffer with Christ can, by our nearness to Christ and his cross, be what Newman refers to as choice instruments and active servants of salvation. In light of this, Father Nicholas Gregoris explains in his book, Daughter of Eve Unfallen, that we Christians can learn to view pain, quote, as a definitive source of final communion with God and the communion of saints, unquote. In other words, our co-suffering is not the ultimate source of redemption. That, of course, is Christ's sacrifice on the cross. But our suffering can participate in that sacrifice of redemption and can merit salvation for us and for others. This, in and of itself, already has pastoral implications. It gives us a sense of hope when we suffer. Saint Therese of Lisieux is a very poignant example, having offered herself as a victim of Holocaust to divine love. But I can also think, and I think we all can, of friends, family members, and members of my own religious community, ordinary, everyday Christians who endure and prayerfully offer up their sufferings for the sake of the world. Filled with this sense of Christian suffering, we can see the cross of Christ and the crosses in our own lives as symbols of hope. This, incidentally, is actually also the motto for my religious community, the Congregation of Holy Cross, which was founded at the same time as Newman was alive, is Ave Crux Spes Unica, Hail the Cross, our only hope. Of all the saints, Mary would be the one whose sufferings are the most acute, even though, according to Newman, she only experienced mental or spiritual and not bodily suffering. This is because Mary is the new Eve. Just as Eve participated in the fall in a secondary sense to that of Adam, the new Eve, who would become her advocate, needed to play a secondary and participatory role in the redemptive act. This would require her, who was the very mother of God, to give her fiat not just once at the Annunciation, but throughout her life in moments of suffering, most especially on the cross. Now that we have briefly discussed the role of suffering on earth, the question may arise what those sufferings matter in the life to come. Newman's theology of the communion of saints not only stresses the fact that the Church triumphant intercedes for us, or that we may invoke their intercession. Rather, Newman also explains well the Catholic concept of patron saints. This he does in his letter to Pusey, in his section on the belief of Catholics in regards to Mary's exaltation and dignity. He starts by noting our natural predisposition as human beings to inscribe in historical and societal memory the names of both terrible and great men and women, to remember their deeds throughout centuries and millennia. Then he goes a step further. He says, and I quote, "What they were here, such they are in heaven and in the church. Their acts, their callings, and relations here below are but types and anticipations of their present mission above." That is, the heavenly realm is a continuation of the mission started here on earth. The ways in which particular saints then were involved here on earth can give us insight into how they will be involved in the lives of Christians once they have passed on to the celestial realm. Newman gives the example of Jesus being priest forever, according to the line of Melchizedek, but I think we can see also Christ's wounds existing in his glorified body, perhaps as an example of the continuation in the beatific vision, although in Christ then in a physical form, which it wouldn't be in all the saints, of the sufferings in this life transferring into the heavenly realm. In our daily lives, we see this idea of missions from this life occurring into the next with commonly known examples. We think of Saint Isidore, a farmer on earth, being the patron of farmers. Saint Therese, who prayed for and wrote letters to missionaries on earth and so greatly desired to be a missionary, is of course a patron saint of the missions. Among all the saints in heaven, however, Mary has a unique role. As the new Eve given to the redeemed at the foot of the cross, she is our spiritual mother. As the mother of all the living, so she has a special maternal compassion for each of us. In addition, on account of her divine maternity and her extreme holiness, her prayer is omnipotent. Indeed, Newman argues in his letter to Pusey that he finds it impossible for those who believe in a communion of saints animated by prayer, quote, in which every holy creature of God has his place, once they recognize the sanctity and dignity of the Blessed Virgin, not to perceive immediately that her office above is one of perpetual intercession for the faithful militant, and that our very relationship to her must be that of clients to a patron, end quote. That is, if we have accepted certain truths of the Christian life regarding the communion of saints, and we have come to see the role of the Blessed Mother that she was given on earth, the only logical conclusion is that in heaven she fulfills this perfect duty of a Christian in constant prayer for us. This then, in turn, drives us to invoke her name for our needs. In the meditation on the titles of the Litany of Loreto, St. John Henry Newman makes the connections between Mary's life here on earth and the titles of honor by which we invoke her. He also shows how these titles are not only honorifics and titles of devotion, but how they show the ministry that Mary is currently performing from the celestial realm. These titles are, in a sense, her many special patronages, one may say, that she now holds in heaven. I will look at these titles now relating to Mary's dolors, which I think are especially applicable to persons who are suffering from illness and for their caretakers, who co-suffer as Mary did at the cross. Mary, under these patronages, not only offers a model for people in these situations, but also provides them comfort and support through her maternal intercession. I will start by looking at the titles relevant to persons who are infirm, and then I shall address the titles relevant to caregivers. There are two of St. John Henry Newman's meditations on Our Lady's dolors that I think can be applied especially well to those who are ill, namely his reflection on Mary as Vas Spirituale and as Consolatrix Afflictorum. Pardon my southern accent with the Latin. In both meditations, Newman notes Mary's own having been consoled in her sorrow. In the former, he notes this so that we may know of these same sources of consolation, and in the latter, he notes it so that we may invoke her intercession. In the meditation on Mary as Vas Spirituale, Newman points out that Mary was able, as a saintly, spiritual-minded person, to, quote, see by faith all those good and holy beings who actually surround us, unquote. That is, she knew the presence of the angels around her, though she did not necessarily always see them physically. Yet this vision and faith, quote, consoled and strengthened her in all her sorrows, unquote, for she knew she could, and she did, relate with the angels, who then would console her. While the directness with which she interacted with them, Newman argues, cannot be attributed to us who are fallen, we still receive the same comfort from the angels. Moreover, we have the Holy Spirit as our paraclete, which Newman translates here as our present help. Newman uses this to bolster the hope of the reader that, quote, even if they have no earthly friend, they have him, unquote, the Lord himself for their help and their consolation. In this meditation, Newman does not necessarily invoke Mary's patronage, but rather he appeals to her example as a starting point for reflection on the beauty of the comfort we may receive from the Lord in the Holy Spirit, mediated through his angels. Even though the meditation, even though the meditation does not explicitly invoke her intercession, it gives ample reason to appeal to Mary's patronage as vas spirituale to help one recall the omnipresent comfort of the Lord and to ask Mary's comfort and to ask Mary to comfort us as she has been comforted. Indeed, the latter of these options is the main topic of the meditation on Mary as Consolatrix Afflictorum. Newman appeals here to Pauline theology. He makes the case that, as Paul, so with Mary, who has been comforted in her trials, she can comfort us by the comfort with which she has been comforted. This, he writes, is why the Blessed Virgin is the comforter of the afflicted. She can comfort us uniquely because of her role as our mother. And she is especially powerful in providing comfort because of the extreme degree to which she has suffered. Interestingly, in expounding on these sufferings, Newman appeals to her time in Egypt and in a foreign pagan land in Ephesus after the resurrection, as well as to the fact that her great love of Jesus made her, quote, more than all the saints of God, a stranger and a pilgrim upon earth, unquote. That is, he cites her seeming estrangement and her presence as a sheep among wolves as her trials. He then recommends her invocation to those who are among the evildoers or whose neighbors are rude, mean, and wicked. That is, to those who feel like Mary did during those similar times of her life. In other words, Newman here applies the concept of patronage to those persons whose life is like Mary's was, a stranger on earth, or in their present place where they live, and says that they should have Mary, Consolatrix Afflictorum, as their patron. One may, however, think of other trials in Mary's life to which to apply the principle of Mary, who has been comforted, comforting us. In fact, it seems to me rather peculiar, unless Cardinal Newman were writing specifically for the purpose of reaching out pastorally to those in estranged situations, that he would not mention her trial at the foot of the cross, which comes up at the forefront in his other works. Therefore, I think we could and should, for our application to the ill, take the general principle Newman uses here and apply it to the care of the sick and of the dying. We could think specifically of her time accompanying St. Joseph in his latter years and standing at the foot of the cross. As she co-suffered with them, with St. Joseph, and with her divine Son, she was indeed consoled, with the consolation with which she could console persons today who are ill. Therefore, it would be appropriate to invoke Mary as Consolatrix Afflictorum and to ask her intercession if one is afflicted by sickness and pain. Yet, we remember that for Newman, Mary did not suffer in body. Therefore, one may object and raise some of the following questions. To what extent is it appropriate to consider Mary as a patron for those who are suffering in body? Would it not be more apt, one might wonder, to have a patron who, by means of his or her bodily suffering, knows intimately well what it is like to suffer in the body? Why not have a patron, for example, who suffered from a similar illness? I certainly think this is an appropriate and very natural question. Yet I also think it misses a main point for Newman. I would like to appeal specifically to Newman's meditation on Mary as Regina Martyrum, Queen of Martyrs. Newman emphasizes that just because Mary has not experienced physical suffering does not mean that she has not experienced suffering of at least as intense a degree. The pains of the soul, Newman says, may be just as fierce as those of the body. He appeals to the agony of those souls in purgatory and the bloody sweat of our Lord in the garden. Do not these demonstrate, he invites one to consider, the sheer force of mental and spiritual anguish? He invites the readers to consider as well whether they have personally experienced such trials, trials that, though not physical, may have felt, quote, like a sword cutting them, or like a weight and force of sorrow which seemed to throw them down, unquote. To suffer agony and anxiety about a future terror, to witness a terrible calamity, to stand with a loved one whose physical anguish we cannot relieve. And here the caregivers can certainly relate. Or to witness a loved one's death, especially at an early age. These examples in our lives hammer home the point that mental and emotional anguish can sometimes be just as bad to bear as the physical. To put these in the context of Mary's life with Jesus, one must only think of the Passion. While more events certainly could be brought to mind, for Newman and in Christian theology in general, the event par excellence of Mary's maternal compassio, or co-suffering, is the cross. On a theological level, this must be the scene in which the compassio is most complete, because it is the undoing of the fall in the garden, and Mary is the new Eve. On a very human level, it is the event in which Mary's mental and emotional suffering is most pronounced because she is watching the brutal crucifixion of her dear Son, whom she knows is innocent and whom she knows is the Lord God. As Christ endures the physical suffering and death, Mary experiences it all internally, in her spirit, quote, as keenly as if every indignity and torture inflicted on him was struck at herself, unquote. As Newman notes in his meditation on Mary's title, Vas Honorabile, he points out the same thing. This is, for Mary, an internal, spiritual martyrdom. It merits her, therefore, the title Regina Martyrum. So, applying this to other examples of Mary's co-suffering, if Mary had seen and stood by the ill during her life and watched loved ones and members of her family die, as she had for St. Joseph and for Christ, and as we can assume she likely did of many others, she would have felt, as she did there at Christ's Passion, their sufferings as her own. She would have felt this internal anguish corresponding to a bodily anguish felt by the ailing individual. She would have experienced their illness on a spiritual level. We can infer then that Mary is not separated from persons with illness by her lack of having suffered physical torment. Her deep care and compassion allow her who has suffered these torments on a spiritual level to reach out to her children who endure them on a physical level. At the same time, one who is suffering may want to have a spiritual connection to a person in the communion of saints with a similar physical condition. Here, of course, we have our whole litany, I say that quite literally, our whole litany of saints from which to choose. For example, St. John Paul II, for persons with neurodegenerative diseases. It may also be worthwhile to mention a very ecumenical distinction made by Newman that he carried over from his Anglican years, namely a distinction between devotion to the saints and their intercession for us. I think this distinction can also be applied here. In his letter to Pusey, Newman argues that devotion to Mary, by which we ask her intercession, is not necessary for salvation. He holds, however, that her intercession is. Mary still, of course, prays for those persons who do not have the privilege of knowing her. If they do not know her, they cannot foster a devotion to her, nor invoke her name. But that does not preclude her praying for them. This point is seemingly obvious, but when I first read it, it actually completely floored me. I had never considered this before. When thinking of Mary's intercession for those who don't have the privilege of knowing her, I had only ever thought of it from the point of view of those of us who do know her, asking her prayers for those who do not. But I had never given thought to the question of her prayers for these people otherwise. I had never actively dismissed it, but I rather had never given it the active thought. And yet it was so obvious. And I think we could take this idea and we could apply it to the intercession of saints who have similar bodily sufferings. I might not know every patron saint for heart problems when I'm talking to a parishioner with congestive heart failure, but I absolutely can assure her that each and every single one of those saints, both those who have been canonized and those in the communion of saints who have not, knows and understands her suffering and is praying for her and is there to comfort her by her intercession. I can remind her that these people are praying for her and supporting her and giving her comfort even if she does not know their names. The Blessed Mother and the whole communion of saints stand by her side, and this can be very hopeful. Before proceeding to the question of Mary's role as it applies to caretakers, I would like to add one more quick note regarding Newman's Mariological pastoral concern for the sick, here for persons specifically with terminal illnesses. In Newman's sermon notes, he writes that we pray to Mary, quote, to help us in the hour of death, for she will not leave us, especially as men get old and lose their earthly relations and those who knew them when they were young, unquote. In these days, we need not think only of persons who are older. The coronavirus pandemic has prevented many persons from being with their families during the final days of their lives on account of safety protocols and lack of personal protective equipment. Families may, in some cases, be present, as we are to each other today, via audio-visual streaming technology, and therefore can certainly be present in prayer. But in other cases, especially in developing countries, there may not be the easy ability to connect with the family digitally or by phone. So when we are reaching out to those who are suffering in this pandemic or in other circumstances that have isolated them from their families, it might be good to remind them of the presence of their Blessed Mother to comfort them and to pray for them. There are, fortunately, many cases in which people are still present to their family members who are ill and suffering. Caretakers are there to minister to those who are sick. When I speak of caretakers, I speak primarily of those persons who are actively providing support in some direct physical way for care of their loved ones who are ill or infirm. As, for example, a high school teacher who ministered to her husband as his life faded away from a degenerative disease. But it can also refer in a secondary sense to those who are accompanying their loved ones in suffering but do not directly provide physical care. And it can also apply to medical professionals who provide physical care but might not be as emotionally involved as the family members, although we should definitely consider that their emotional involvement is certainly not negligible. I refer to the first group as caretakers in a primary sense, not only because that is the more common usage of the term caregiver, but also because the pastoral implications of Newman's meditations apply to this group in a more direct sense than the other groups, although certain aspects apply to the other groups of caregivers as well, whence I refer to them as secondary groups. We must consider that we have to minister as well, and we have this privilege of ministering to caretakers. And for these situations, there are apt Marian titles in Newman's meditations. specifically those on Vas Insigniae Devotionis, Virgo Prudentissima, Vas Honorabile, and Turris Eburnea. I shall address the meditations on Virgo Prudentissima and Vas Insigniae Devotionis together regarding the external actions of the caretakers. Then briefly, the internal state of the caretaker in Vas Insigniae Devotionis, Vas Honorabile, and Turris Eburnea. Newman's explanation of Mary as Virgo Prudentissima takes into consideration the practical matters and day-to-day concerns of her life, both in good times and in bad times. While Newman gives some consideration to Mary's cares in Egypt and in Nazareth, the examples of most import for caretakers come later in her life, ministering to the early church. She had, Newman's writes, quote, duties to the martyrs and to confessors in prison, to the sick, to the ignorant, and to the poor, unquote. Applying the previous principle of Marian Compassion, which she certainly felt not only for Jesus, but for all her spiritual children, she would have felt at least as keen a suffering that as that felt by taking care of a bedridden spouse or an ill child. She would have been visiting and caring for all those who had been beaten and tortured, those about to undergo unjust death, the sick, the marginalized. She would know well, not just from her compassion at the foot of the cross, but from these duties that she carried out in ministering to the infant church, the pain and suffering that caregivers today feel in even the most terrible and desolate moments. She not only knows the pain, but also the duties involved with directly caring for others and having to continue to live daily life while providing this care. She felt the pain and agony and exercised prudence in carrying out a caregiver's duties in the face of it. Although the practice and the duties specifically involved in caregiving have changed over the course of the past 2 millennia, the principle has not. This principle, simply put, is devotion. In his meditation on Mary as Vas Insigniae Devotionis, Newman characterizes devotedness to someone as having the other person as the center of our thoughts, someone so deeply loved, so tenderly cherished, he writes, that the lover, quote, follows him about with her eyes and is ever seeking some manner of serving him, end quote, such that even if the services are but small, they are constant. Do we not see this in family caretakers? On a minor level, I can think of my mother bringing me toast when I would come down with fever as a child. On a much more extreme level, I think of a friend whose child had a traumatic brain injury. She went every day to the hospital to visit him. His sister and his friend sat in the room with him and talked to him when he could barely move. And they'd get things for him when he would unknowingly drop them, move his cords when he got tangled up. They were devoted to him. This is what we see in our caretakers today. And this is the kind of devotion that Newman sees in Mary. Having Christ and his sufferings at the center of her eye and caring for him in the little ways that she could during her time together at Nazareth and at the foot of the cross. She likewise would have been devoted in caring for the members of the early church. For this reason, Mary is a particularly powerful intercessor for caretakers under the titles Virgo Prudentissima and Vas Insigniae Devotionis, that they too may remain devoted and render prudent and devoted service to the person who is suffering. There is yet another reason that Mary's intercession under the title Vas Insigniae Devotionis is so powerful and important for caretakers, namely the connection between devotedness to a person and the inward state of spiritual co-suffering one experiences when accompanying him or her in sorrow. When one is close to someone else, is devoted to and loves the other, she experiences his pain as her own. As mentioned above, this was especially the case for Mary on account of her intimate bond with Christ and on account of her unique holiness. According to Newman, Mary experienced all Christ's pains and agony as intensely on a spiritual level as if they had been inflicted on herself. Newman echoes this thought in the following meditation on Mary as Vas Honorabile, in which he calls her co-suffering a fellow passion, quote, being crucified with him, end quote. This is very strong language in which he shows that Mary's sufferings are very real and perhaps even as intense as Christ's own. I believe caretakers identify with this as well, although our fallenness might obscure some of the intensity of the pain. When watching a loved one in a home hospice, accompanying one diagnosed with a possibly terminal illness, or caring for one whose age has crippled their bodies, there is a real sympathy we all experience on account of our humanity. While we might not feel their pain as they feel it, we feel it as if it were our own. There is yet one more important feature of the text on Mary as vas honorabile for caretakers, namely that Mary stood up, still, collected, motionless. This is not just a passage by a 19th century Stoic Englishman. Rather, taking its roots from the Gospel and from the Stabat Mater, it shows Mary's position in a manner that Newman explains later in his Turris Eburnea. Mary stands at the foot of the cross because she has the courage to face the suffering and accept the will of the Father. In contrast to the apostles, who, as Newman points out, fled though St. John returned, Mary stayed with her son to the end. She towered over the other disciples in her courage to face this suffering. He then contrasts her standing to that of groveling in the dust. He says that she stood upright to receive the blows, the stabs, which the long passion of her son inflicted upon her. Therefore, her standing has a purpose. It is to receive. It is in order to take the pain and offer it to the Father. She has an active role there in her co-suffering. Her co-suffering parallels the active emotional suffering of a caretaker at the side of a hospital bed. The temptation may come, like the disciples, who were all very devoted to the Lord during his life, to flee from the pain out of a fear to embrace this co-suffering, or a sense of inability to accept it. Perhaps these factors are present on a very mundane and commonly seen level in cases where people who may not know how to offer up co-suffering show up to a hospital room but are disengaged and distracted by means of phones and TV for the whole time. On a very extreme level, I think it might be part of the reason why our society has started to push to abort children with disabilities and to euthanize persons with terminal illnesses. Our culture does not want to do the hard work of co-suffering with others. Each of us can probably point to times in our own lives when we have intentionally avoided co-suffering because of a concern that we did not know how or could not face it. Mary, in the face of this, stands against our culture, providing the example of one who does not merely try to distract herself from the reality of the situation, but actively embraces the pain, feels it as her own, and prayerfully offers it to the Father. Through this Mariology, we can give caregivers hope that their co-sufferings indeed are also salvific, just as Mary's was. Not only can we show them the value of their co-suffering, but we can use the titles of Mary as Vas Insigne Devotionis, Vas Honorabile, and Turris Eburnea to invoke her help so that caregivers who suffer in soul on account of their devotion to someone suffering in body may be filled with the same resolve that filled Mary and may offer their co-suffering courageously. In sum, Mary's co-suffering with Christ allowed her a special type of patronage for those who are ill and for those who care for them. Although she did not endure any physical pains, according to Newman, the pain she experienced was the pain that she witnessed, most especially at the Lord's Passion, a pain she experienced as her own, undergoing a spiritual martyrdom just as heavy and dreadful as a physical one. Her titles Va Spirituale and Consolatrix Afflictorum appeal to her own having been strengthened in her suffering and are especially valuable titles and ideas to use in ministry to those who are suffering or ill. We see in these titles that we Christians receive consolation from God himself through his holy angels. We see also that Mary, who was tried so much and strengthened in these same trials will help us to know and to experience this same consolation. By the titles Virgo Prudentissima and Vas Insigne Devotionis, we invoke Mary's intercession and example for caretakers in their duties, that they may carry out their mission wisely and lovingly. Finally, in her titles Vas Insigne Devotionis, Vas Honorabile, and Turris Eburnea, we apply these to all caretakers and also to our culture. Those whose loved ones are suffering may invoke her by these titles, asking her that they may not flee to distract themselves from the suffering or to put an early end to someone's life on account of such suffering as our culture may try to push for, but rather may courageously receive and offer to the Father their co-suffering. These few titles are but some of the glories of Mary, yet they show many pastoral implications for our world today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Luke. That was an awesome study and look into Newman's Mariology, and especially pertinent for today with connections to make about co-suffering and the COVID situation, and how we can respond to the culture. So thank you very much for that. So we have 10 minutes, I think. We have, well, technically 8 minutes for questions. So so if you have a question, I guess you could raise your hand and then I'll just go in order. So I see Bob has a question. So Bob, you can go ahead. Just unmute yourself.
Unmuted. Thank you very much, Luke. That was, Luke, do I have that right? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. That's a very deep topic, which I think it's a very important one. Usually avoided because it's so deep and can be so troubling. I have one question and then just one note on something I've been thinking about myself lately. Did you come across anything specific in Newman or anywhere else in your research regarding Mary's state of mind between the time of the death of Jesus and the time of the resurrection? Up to the cross, I understand it pretty well, but I haven't come across anything yet that deals with Mary during that period of. I've often wondered lately what was going through her mind. What was going through her mind? What must she have been suffering as a mother after Jesus was finally dead, and then she was left to deal with that fact until the resurrection occurred? Did you come across anything during that time period?
Thank you. That's a really good question. And I think it's a really good question because it looks especially at a time that we all can identify with, because it's, in a sense, our own, not only with Christ's death and then his resurrection, but I think we see it as well with when we experience the death of our loved ones. And I know that there are writings out there on it. I have not yet encountered any by Newman. I stumbled by something, but it was a long while ago, and it was not in Newman, and I really cannot, honestly, for the life of me, I cannot recall right now where exactly that was. But it certainly is. I believe that there were meditations on it, and I think especially more in the late Middle Ages, I think you would have a lot of that as the sense of, especially this sense of the like the spirituality of the death and the passion and the emotion there becomes so raw and so real. kind of going into the modern era. It's certainly also good for just reflection and meditation in general, especially with the Seven Sorrows. I bet there are good Seven Sorrows meditations out there that have reflections on it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Just one note I wanted to pass on. If you may have seen them already, but in terms of Newman's personal experience with suffering and during his time in the parish at St. Stephen's, he made it a point to visit every household in the parish. And in his letters and diaries, he has written accounts of 10 major cases of people that he visited. They're very, very vivid accounts, especially the effect it had on him. And in his diary, he ultimately says that those experiences are what really broke him from Calvinism. It broke his sense of predestination when he sat with people who were very seriously ill and even on up through their death. So it just might be something you might be interested in exploring. They're in the letters and diaries.
Thank you, Bob. Anyone else have any questions or comments? Yes, Christopher. So if you'd unmute yourself. And if you could, do you want us to call you Chris or Christopher?
Christopher is great.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there was one point that you were very insistent about, and it seems like it has its own reasons to it, but maybe if you could give an explanation about Newman saying that Christ suffered both bodily and spiritually in his passion, but that Mary experienced no bodily suffering. So I guess it hinges on the Mariological aspect of your talk. What's the reason for that insistence that Mary had no bodily suffering in those moments?
Yes, it's something that I found at first somewhat interesting when I came across it. I think because it comes first, it's in his exploration of her role in relation to the martyrs, and showing that while she didn't undergo the physical martyrdom, she still had that same emotional, intense spiritual experience, the mental anguish. It was unclear to me. It seemed from the phrasing he used there that he was also implying that Mary had no other physical sufferings during her life. But I've not substantiated that by, say, a complete reading of his collected works. So I'm unaware, and there are certainly people here who know better than I do on that point.
Okay, so we have a minute left. Christopher, did you have a follow-up to that, or was that good?
No, I think that that's helpful for me. Thank you. Thank you, Luke.
Okay, I just have one quick question. Just you said some of what you talked about came from the Mary's Dolores, is that right? Now, do you remember what date that was and what time period? Was that pre-Catholic, post-Catholic, or during Catholic?
It was Catholic. It was published posthumously. I believe it was published posthumously, if I recall.
Okay. Very good. And then, so forgive my Latin's very rusty, but can you translate the Turris Eburnea?
That is the ivory tower. And so he mentions that she towers over the disciples who fled, and in her courage, standing there co-suffering with them, with Christ, that's how she towers over in a sense. But then she's a tower of ivory because she is gentle and loving. And so that's how he applies that title there.
Great, thank you very much. So we are at the end of our allotted time, which is 7:20, and the next session starts at 8:30. So I don't want you to be late because you might need to take a quick break. So again, let us join in giving a thumbs up or silent clap to Luke and for his great presentation.
Thank you, Luke.
So
Thank you.
so again, so one, thank you, and again, welcome to the St. John Henry Newman Association annual conference. So I think what the logistics of this would be, you can leave this meeting and then go ahead and log into the Zoom link for the next meeting. So everyone have a great evening. Hopefully we'll see you all throughout the conference. So, peace.
Thank you, Ono.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ono.
Oh, you're welcome.